Imagine the chilling sound of iron doors creaking open, the dim torchlight casting eerie shadows along a corridor, where the anguished cries of the condemned echo through the air. For women imprisoned in medieval Europe, this wasn't a scene from myth, it was the brutal and horrifying reality that marked the beginning of their incarceration. The moment a woman crossed into a medieval jail, whether in England or France, she was not just deprived of her freedom, but stripped of her identity, sometimes literally. One of the first acts recorded in several European prisons was the shaving of a woman's head. This wasn't merely for hygiene, it was a powerful symbol. In medieval society, hair was not just a physical attribute, it was intimately tied to dignity, modesty, and femininity. Shaving a woman's head was not simply an act of humiliation, it was a deliberate attempt to degrade and break her spirit. Next came the shackles. Whether guilty or merely accused women were often bound in iron restraints. In 13th century England, records describe women being held in bilboes, a form of iron leg restraint, or chained directly to the prison walls. These prisons were not built for justice. They were cold, damp stone chambers, often constructed as extensions of castles, monasteries, or town halls. Women were thrown into these spaces alongside thieves, debtors, and the condemned. Separate facilities for women were virtually non-existent until the 15th century. Let them be confined and abased, wrote German legal scholar Ulrich Tengler in Der Leinspiegel 1509, a legal manual used throughout the Holy Roman Empire. For women, prison wasn't about reform, it was about punishment, humiliation, and stripping away their very humanity. These initial steps, shaving, shackling, and public exposure, were not just the beginning of incarceration, they were the beginning of erasure. Not all punishments in medieval prisons were immediately visible. Some worked slowly, silently, and just as brutally. Beneath the dungeons of medieval castles and shadowed recesses, there were rooms known as hunger chambers. These starvation cells became a death sentence for many women, without trial or justice. These small, windowless enclosures were no larger than a coffin in some cases. Prisoners were left without light, bedding, or food. In 14th century France, the oubliette, literally meaning the forgotten place, became notorious. Women were lowered into these underground shafts through a trap door, often never to be seen again. Some oubliettes were carved directly into castle rock foundations, such as those at Loches Castle or the Bastille. Once the door closed above them, few ever saw daylight again. While starvation was not always officially declared as punishment in practice, it became a common tool. Records from medieval English jails suggest that women accused of moral crimes or suspected of witchcraft were kept in close ward without bread or water for days. The conditions in these cells accelerated suffering. Without sanitation, food, or warmth, even the healthiest bodies deteriorated quickly. Women often lay in their own filth, covered in lice and sores. Death came from dehydration, malnutrition, or slow infections. For some, the psychological torture came first. Many prisoners screamed for days before eventually falling silent. Yet their deaths were often undocumented, their names erased from records, and their bodies buried in unmarked graves outside prison walls. These hunger cells were not merely a tool of punishment, they were a deliberate act of erasure. They were spaces where women were neither executed nor freed, simply left to vanish. And in that silence, the system achieved its most chilling effect. It taught other women to fear not only guilt, but accusation itself. For the women who entered these dark, forsaken places, punishment wasn't proclaimed, it was simply endured. Forgotten by law and history, they died nameless, their suffering absorbed by the cold stone surrounding them. Beyond the starvation chambers, some women faced permanent marks that branded them for life. In medieval Europe, the concept of crime was inextricably linked with moral and religious codes. For women, being labeled as sinful could lead to brutal punishments, even without evidence of violent crimes. Accusations of adultery or other so-called immoral behaviors were often enough to bring the full force of both civic and ecclesiastical justice upon them. Once convicted, many of these women bore their sentence forever permanently marked on their bodies. Branding as a corporal punishment became legally sanctioned in parts of Europe, especially by the late medieval period. In England, branding was used from at least the 13th century for crimes like theft or repeat offenses. By the 15th century, it was extended to women accused of vice crimes. A 1563 statute under Queen Elizabeth I confirmed the use of branding for vagrants, often including Women labeled as night walkers, a term used for suspected prostitutes. They could be branded with a permanent V on their upper bodies, marking them for life. Branding wasn't universally applied, and its use varied by region and time period. But when it was imposed, especially on women, it not only caused physical pain, but also marked them with a permanent social death sentence. A branded woman could never return to ordinary life. Her flesh spoke louder than any defense she could offer. Branding wasn't just a tool for punishment, it was a tool for permanent moral condemnation. For women accused of immorality, it meant living as a constant open symbol of disgrace, a design meant to publicly shame them for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, those accused of witchcraft endured torturous treatment even before they were tried. These were not post-conviction punishments. They were methods used during interrogation, often before any trial began. By the late 15th century, witchcraft accusations surged, especially after the publication of Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, a legal and theological manual written by inquisitors Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. It claimed that women by their nature were more prone to witchcraft and deceit, and it endorsed the use of torture to extract confessions. Torture was officially sanctioned under Roman law and canon law provided there was sufficient suspicion. In parts of Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and France, torture devices were routinely used to question suspected witches. The strappado, one of the most common methods, involved binding a woman's arms behind her back, hoisting her by a rope, and then dropping her, suddenly causing extreme strain on her shoulders. Other methods included the thumbscrew, which applied crushing pressure to the fingers, and the boot, which compressed the legs with wedges until serious injury occurred. The rack, used primarily in England and the Low Countries, stretched the body to the point of joint damage, often leaving lasting harm. What made these acts so horrifying was that confessions extracted under torture were not just expected, they were demanded. Often women were forced to name others, leading to further arrests. In some German towns, entire female communities were wiped out as a result. In Würzburg, 1626 to 1631, though slightly post-medieval, over 150 women were executed following confessions extracted under torture. In medieval witch trials, the prison cell became a chamber of prejudgment. Torture wasn't a punishment, it was a tool for shaping the narrative the authorities wanted to hear, long before any verdict was rendered. Medieval prisons laid bare how fear and doctrine could weaponize law, turning justice into ritual humiliation and slow death. These cruelties reshaped legal codes and reinforced patriarchal power, and they still echo today whenever authority is used to control morality. How do you think the treatment of women in these prisons reflected the values and fears of medieval society? Share your thoughts below. Imagine the echo of iron doors creaking open, a torch-lit corridor filled with the cries of the condemned. For women imprisoned in medieval Europe, this was no myth. It was a brutal reality. The moment a woman crossed into a jail, her identity was stripped away, sometimes literally. One of the first acts of humiliation was shaving her head, symbolizing the loss of dignity and femininity. Then came the shackles binding her in iron restraints. Prisons were not for justice, but for punishment and degradation. Women were often thrown into dark, cold dungeons alongside criminals without any distinction. Separate facilities for women were rare until the 15th century. In the hidden recesses of these prisons were hunger chambers, places of starvation and death. Women were locked away, deprived of food, light, and warmth, left to wither away in silence. These cells were designed not just for physical punishment, but for complete erasure of the woman's existence both in life and history. Branding was another punishment, marking women as immoral or sinful for crimes like adultery or suspected witchcraft. These marks were permanent and socially condemning, ensuring the woman would never again live a life of dignity. Meanwhile, women accused of witchcraft faced brutal torture, forced confessions, and were often executed based on the lies they were coerced into telling. These cruel practices reflect the values and fears of medieval society: control, power, and the complete dehumanization of women. It's a chilling reminder of the dangers of fear-driven justice and the importance of preserving dignity and fairness for all. How do you think these treatments reflect medieval society's fears and values? Reflect on the lessons we can learn from this dark history.